Welcome everybody to this first iPEN hosted free webinar for this year. And I'm going to open with a karakia and then I'm going to hand over to Bruce, Andrew and Mark, who are going to be speaking to us about the role relationships and partnerships play in achieving research impact. Okay, manawa mai te Māori nuku, manawa mai te Māori rangi. Ko te Māori ki aho he Māori tipua, ka pakaru mā te pau. Humie huie taiki.
Okay.
All right, well, I won't waste any further time speaking to you. I'd like to hand swiftly over to Bruce, Andrew and Mark, and really looking forward to hearing all about this quite impressively long partnership and the sorts of things that we don't hear enough about, I don't think, about all of the science that's going on in New Zealand and sort of this really important foundation that's sitting there often unacknowledged or not acknowledged as well as it could be. So yeah, thanks again for agreeing, and over to you.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Cara, and I'd just firstly like to thank iPEN for the opportunity for the three of us to present to you this lunchtime. So hopefully you can eat your lunch while we're presenting. So I'm Bruce Warburton. I'm a science team leader at Manaki Whenua based at Lincoln. And if I can introduce my co-presenters is Andrew Gormley, who's also with Manaki Whenua Landcare Research, and Mark Neal at Osprey. So this presentation covers sort of lessons that we've taken from a very long-term sort of relationship and partnership that Manaki Whenua has had with Osprey. And Mark's going to sort of lead the way, going through a few slides, putting the talk and the partnership in context, that operational context, and describing what the impact is that we think we've had. And then Andrew's going to cover the sort of the why and the how it's worked, the partnership and our relationship. And then I'm going to finish off at the end with just 3 or 4 slides, what we think the sort of the positive and the negative factors are that might influence our ability to deliver impact. So Mark, I'll hand over to you, and I'm going to drive the slides, so it might be a wee bit stilted as we go. But thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Bruce. So bovine tuberculosis in New Zealand, essentially this is a global cattle disease that affects all mammalian species, including human beings. It's caused by Mycobacterium bovis. Unlike a lot of diseases where there's multifactorial causes, this is a specific organism that causes a specific disease picture to be presented, and it's been a long-standing organism that survived for many millennia in the world and has created a bit of a niche for itself. It's quite a difficult disease to get on top of because of its behavior in the body. So it spreads via aerosols directly, so through breath, through saliva, and potentially through raw milk, more meat and raw milk as well. In New Zealand, it's often spread by possums in particular, but it also can be spread by ferrets and can be present in pigs and wild deer. Next slide, thanks. So in terms of the context for New Zealand, in the late 60s, the possum was identified as a host of TB infection. It was identified that these herds in specific areas of the country that normally would clear through a test and slaughter process were becoming infected again, and it just so happened there were infected possums in those locations. And through the late 70s, the government was spending quite a lot of money for the time in controlling possums and found there was a significant drop in the amount of infection. But through the 80s, there was other priorities for spending, and you can see on the graph there that the number of infected herds increased. In the late 80s, deer, which is the green bars, were introduced as compulsory testing, and you can see it continued on through to the mid-90s. And through research and understanding better the disease and design of our control programs, and carrying on with that test and slaughter program, you can see the very, very dramatic, although being over a reasonable period of time, drop in the level of infection to the current day. So around 24 infected herds from a height of around 1,700 infected herds in the mid-90s. Thanks, Bruce. Here's a graphic just giving you an indication of a comparison between 2003 and 2022. So the pie graphs are indicating the proportion of infection, and the size of the pie is the number of infected herds within each region. Please note that those shapes are centrally centered within the region and don't represent specifically where the infected herds are. You can see there's been a significant reduction in the infected herds, and it has filtered down from being throughout most of the country where there's farmland down to 2 foci of infection, one in the Hawke's Bay and one actually in Harry on the west coast. So thanks for that, Bruce. That's cool. Oh, jumping backwards and forwards there. Herds become infected as a result of local wildlife. They also become infected with the movement of livestock. So there are some other infected herds dotted around the country as well. And we made good progress, but the job isn't finished yet. Thanks, Bruce. Here's just a very local example of the progress that's been made. It's looking at a comparison from 1988. You can see Mount Ruapehu at the bottom and Lake Taupo off to the right-hand side. So the blue dots were infected herds as at the end of the financial year 1988 and compared to 2023. Thanks, Bruce. So the approach that Osprey's taken to get there is using a 3-legged stool approach, which is testing of animals. That's a test and slaughter program, putting movement restrictions in place where there's an area risk associated with it, and also wildlife surveillance and control, where a lot of research has been put into this area to understand better the species that we're controlling and the surveillance species that we use. So we've underpinned this strategy with science-based thinking. And we've had CEOs with very strong research supporting positions going forward. And we've had a budget of up to $80 million. It did drop in 2016 down to $60 million per year. And back in the day, $2 million of that was allocated specifically for research. Thanks, Bruce.
Yes, I'll jump in here. So I currently sort of oversee the research priority area in terms of wildlife disease and modelling, of which our Osprey work has been a huge focus. So I guess before my time, but we've had Manaaki Whenua Research has had sort of TB related research from Osprey. There's an asterisk there because they've had a name change since the Animal Health Board in the earlier days. But sort of since the sort of mid 2000s really, and we've had sort of attracted research and bid for research around that 1 to 2 million sort of a year. Fluctuates a little bit. There was a memorandum of understanding that was set up in 2014 to 2016, of which Osprey would contribute sort of co-designed research a certain amount of money, and we would put in some of the core funding, as it was called in those days, which was the MBIE, it's now called SIF, Strategic Science Investment Fund, and sort of a 3-to-1 kind of a ratio of funding. And that was some co-designed sort of research, but more of an informal partnership, looking at a whole range of aspects, including disease, wildlife disease epidemiology around the possums as hosts, as well as a lot of other factors in terms of sort of broad scale aerial control, reducing the amount of 1080, those sorts of things. A formal partnership was signed and ran for 3 years in 2017, and that was a much more sort of formalized co-design of an annual research program, of which there was a similar amount of funding in terms of the fundamental research, as well as the opportunity to bid in for sort of contestable applied research funding, depending on the research aims. An important part, I think, of that formal partnership was this capability fund that both organisations contributed to, which enabled us to sort of put together a number of fact sheets and things for stakeholders, but importantly, it gave Osprey staff the opportunity and ability to contact researchers here at any time to ask for small advice or run small jobs rather than having to contract lots of small jobs. So kind of removing some of that bureaucracy around from that. Osprey had a technical advisory group that would review all the research priorities as well as the contract outputs. The formal partnership has ended, but we still sort of work closely with Osprey on research going forward. It's a little bit of a sunset industry and we always knew it would be in terms of what we needed to know as two organisations around the role of possums. Once we've sort of learned a lot, and going forward we can now just apply that. If we go to the next slide, Bruce. So just as an example of I guess one of the main sort of areas of research that we work together on, and give you a sense of the scale and the timing of it, I suppose. The Proof of Freedom is a framework that analyses the surveillance data. So this is where Osprey, under the TB-free program, have carried out the control and then go in and do surveillance to check remaining possums and sentinels, pigs and the like for any TB, hopefully not to find any, and build up a case to revoke an area's TB status. So this was initially developed probably 2010, maybe a little bit earlier. And importantly, in terms of impact, it wasn't developed by us in isolation. It was developed in collaboration with sort of key Osprey staff and refined over that time. There was a software tool that was released in 2013 that gave the area disease managers the ability to sort of analyse their own data and produce sort of standardised outputs to build those cases. And so this has formed a key component of that revocation process. So where management units are put up to be decided one way or another whether their TB status will be revoked. And since 2013, there's been a number of research projects that have been aligned to that, and sort of continual research and development over the 10 years since. Thanks, Bruce. Another important sort of aspect, not sort of formal as part of the partnership agreement, but sort of alongside that, we've had secondments to Osprey from Manaaki Whenua. So we've had 2 staff that have been seconded there and established close links with the operational staff, sort of working in the offices of Osprey. And it's been a two-way sort of trade, really. So it's increased our knowledge of their operational and research needs, and helps us define what research questions are the priorities going forward. And it also gives the Osprey staff that sort of immediate access to some key sort of wildlife disease and ecological sort of expertise. As a bit of an extension in terms of sort of some of the outputs and outcomes, or outputs, I guess. I mean, over the life of the program so far, probably 20 years or so, there's been 370 plus research contract reports been delivered, so a huge quantum of work. There's a searchable database that's sort of under development at the moment, but they are all sort of able to be found. Manaaki Whenua staff attend the Osprey regional workshops to help disseminate the latest research to sort of key stakeholders, interest groups, and to also sort of identify what those, the current problems and priorities are. We've had a range of formal presentations at conferences, biosecurity bonanzas, these sorts of things, both nationally and internationally. TB is obviously a global thing, and so there's lots of learnings that we can glean from the overseas researchers. In terms of sort of fact sheets for farmers, stakeholders, agencies, we've sort of co-developed with Osprey a number of those, and there's a graphic there showing a couple of those, just to sort of boiled, just to reduce down our research into sort of easy sort of take-home messages that anyone can understand. As well as that, obviously numerous peer-reviewed journal publications, and this has been important, I think, for Osprey to be able to go to their board and stakeholders and demonstrate that their science-based sort of thinking has had peer review. It's very robust. The partnership was able to fund a special issue of that New Zealand Veterinary Journal, and that research, co-authored with Osprey staff, Manaaki Whenua staff, and other internationals, was able to support the review and update of the National Pest Management Plan. And so that shifted the initial goal of achieving TB freedom, which is kind of a sort of a global terminology where it's 0.2% of herds infected, realize that we can actually move stronger away from that to the current sort of goal, which is eradication from livestock by, that should say 2026, so there's still a couple of years left there. Possums from 2040 and complete biological eradication by 2055. Bruce.
You're on mute, Bruce.
How's that? Can you hear me now?
Much better.
Perfect.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Andrew. So I've just got 3 or 4 slides here, and this is more at a higher level, just some thoughts about the pros and cons of why we think we might have an impact or why we may not be delivering as much impact as we would like. So I've just listed this continuum here, or spectrum here, from applied science on the left to fundamental on the right. And I think the impact that we deliver, particularly in the short to medium term, is delivered through more applied research, and even more so at the very operational end of the spectrum. And it's not to say we don't need fundamental. We do need fundamental research, because in 5, 10, 15 years time, some of that fundamental research will be what you're applying. So you need that continual pipeline, developing that fundamental research, but feeding through to the applied side of it. And if we just look at the funding, and again, it's not the scale here, it's just the sort of the shape more than the quantums. And again, this is our perception of the world, I guess the scientist's perception of the world. So again, applied, the sort of operational people, the agencies, want to they want immediate impact, and they fund that very, very operationally applied research, and they're averse to funding risky science. So this is in general. We have MB at the other end of that spectrum. They have their funding through endeavour and smart ideas. They're looking for novelty, stretch, and not business as usual. And then we have this almost gap in the middle, which I've just termed strategically applied research, and that has a potential to deliver high impact and a lot more impact, and we don't believe it's being fully supported. SIF plays a role in there, but there needs to be I think a better or a stronger pipeline bringing that fundamental research that might, you might have an endeavour program for 5 years, and then there's nothing secure in terms of shifting or moving that or the research results from that, say, endeavour program through to being applied and having an impact. So there's an issue there that needs to be addressed. So just go back a few years. So pre-MB, there was the FORCE, the Foundation of Research, Science and Technology, and they did fund 2 large programs related to bovine TB, one sustaining TB freedom and one TB suppression systems. And we think these were funded because at that stage you had to show you had a close relationship with an end user that could use your results. and deliver an outcome. And it did contribute significantly to that impact that Mark described. But if we put these programs into MB now, as an endeavour, for example, these would now be seen as too applied, too business as usual, not novel enough, and they would score low in science excellence. But they're incredibly important for delivering a lot of our understanding needed to really deliver impact. So our last slide is just a bit of a summary. So in terms of our partnership with Osprey, Osprey's funding robust science because both the CEO and their research manager and their staff, like Mark, believe that they want to underpin their technical and operational decisions with robust and sound science. In terms of that proof of freedom framework that Andrew talked through, this is giving them evidence-based objective decisions on when to stop, control and revoke an area and declare TB freedom. The partnership really developed an excellent working relationship between researchers at Manaaki Whenua and the end users within Osprey, and that relationship is still continuing, but it was based on a long-term and stable relationship, and I mean over decades. And it was really developed with the two people shown there, Paul Livingston, who was their research manager in Osprey, and Graham Nugent, who led the TB research program in Manaaki Whenua that Andrew now has taken over. So both those two gentlemen have retired. Both of those had and delivered strong and strategic leadership, which again was important. And the funding in that partnership enabled Manaaki Whenua, particularly in terms of research, to maintain a team with diverse skills. And the whole research program was based on continual and incremental improvement. So yeah, so I think that's all we need to say. So open to questions, Cara. I've just got one last slide that might encapsulate the partnership that we have with Manaaki Whenua and Osprey. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Bruce. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great, thanks. That's yeah, that's super. Thank you. Now, what I neglected to do at the start of today is just let you know what the process will be for managing the chat. I'll just oh yep, there we go. Got the stop sharing. Perfect. Yep. So we and actually, if I may say, in the nature of relationships and partnerships, certainly do welcome people actually posing their questions as a person, taking themselves off mute and asking it directly. But also appreciate some of you might have your mouths full or aren't so comfortable with that. So you're also welcome to put questions into the chat along the side. But I've got a couple of just a couple of little comments, reflections that I'd like to share before we get before we crack on. And Tracy, I think I saw you had your hand up before, so I'll come to you shortly. But a couple of things that stood out to me, which I thought were really valuable and highlight points that I think are definitely not just something that's important to acknowledge in the science system, but the sorts of things that I've seen in some of the other evaluation work that I've done in other sectors has been the fact that you've kind of combined that combination of research in particular here that you're talking about and and you've been able to kind of stitch that together, not off sort of transactional relationships where you have someone putting out an RFP, but maybe they don't know what they don't know and they're asking for the wrong thing. That actually the fact that you've had this actual relationship that has built off people having conversations with one another, seeking to understand. It's that virtuous circle that comes from conversation, and conversation that happens over long periods of time, that it seems has helped you identify that need for sort of the combination of support. So you had the fundamental, the applied, and the capability. So I think it's a really it's impressive way to highlight that the value of that particular combination. But the other thing that I think your presentation has illustrated nicely is, if I reflect on my own journey, but also then from an iPEN perspective, when we listen to some of the concerns or anxieties that some scientists and researchers have, when it feels like there's this big focus on impact, but what about the actual research itself? You gave a really good, it's not an and or, it's an and the real importance of having peer-reviewed journals. It gives you a credible evidence base that you can then use to get the decisions made, the plans changed, and so on. So I think it was really nice, and thank you for highlighting that, because it's painting a slightly different picture, but it's not to diminish the value and the importance of that work. Yeah, so thank you. So those are just a couple of reflections. I've got a couple of questions, but I'm going to save those till later. Tracy, did you have a question?
Yeah, kia ora, Cara, and thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and such a fantastic example of co-innovation in action and how science has made a difference. I'm very interested in some of your pathways to impact, and during the presentation you mentioned the importance of joint publications. So there was a good, robust evidence base, and that informed policy. So that was a fantastic example of a pathway through to making a difference. Have you got any other examples of how you worked together along what iPEN calls impact pathways, to illustrate to the people listening?
Well, I think one example is what Andrew went through in the development of the proof of freedom framework. There was a lot of theory and modelling was done, but to make it impactful, it had to be packaged in a tool that Osprey operational staff could use, and that was done jointly with staff from Manaaki Whenua and staff from Osprey. So I think that's another example.
Another one, a decision-making tool.
Yeah, and I guess along with that, I mean, the development of some of the theory and putting it into practice was, I mean, we had endless, it felt like lots and lots of workshops, sort of workshops, sort of pulling apart the statistical model about how to analyze this data and what some of those parameter values might be. And so it was, I mean, there's definitely a history of organizations developing tools for a stakeholder that get developed in isolation and then don't get used. And so this was a real key example of a real co-design and the continual improvement that's gone on with that. But I mean, some of us in our team were sort of came from a statistical modeling base, as well as sort of ecologists working with the Osprey staff that were predominantly sort of vets, I guess, and so trying to learn each other's languages a little bit as well. That always takes time. So yeah.
Right. So a transdisciplinary team, and you lived in each other's worlds. Yeah. Thanks so much.
We're also looking for financial sort of benefits as well. So how can we find the most effective way with just enough surveillance going forward? And there was some collaborative work in that space as well between the two organisations, how we could refine the process.
Yeah. So thanks, Tracy. Just to build on that question, there's increasing examples of that co-design process and research, but it's still, you know, it's certainly not the dominant paradigm, and maybe it doesn't need to be. I don't know. But we know that for certain, you know, when we're trying to take science along that pathway from the fundamental through to application, you need to bring that together at some point. If you could, Andrew, and perhaps Mark and Bruce, you're welcome to answer this as well. What advice might you have given yourselves with the benefit of hindsight, and say to yourself 10 years ago, hey, be aware that this part's going to be surprising or really hard? Or yeah, so what kind of advice might you give to your historical selves?
I mean, for me, I guess I was quite fortunate because I came in about 2010, 11, where the relationship that Graham Nugent and Paul Livingston had was very, very strong. So there was already a really strong working relationship with Mark and Bruce and others as well. So yeah, I mean, normally I would say, you know, to have, you know, more sort of meetings and open discussions and challenge each other's ideas. But yeah, I mean, I was lucky. I mean, that relationship was already happening. Yeah.
And my advice to my younger self would be, when building a platform, think about the software that you're using for that, to make sure that it's in a format that is adaptable and you can build the changes into going forward.
Yeah.
And if I can add to that, it would be just to spend more time with your partner. So you need time to build up respect and trust, and that takes time, and you need that for a really good partnership. And you've got to be prepared to listen, and you've got to be prepared to get out of bed to solve other people's problems, not just to do your science.
Can I just follow up on that comment then, Bruce? So iPEN last year spent, we did a sort of a special project which was sort of a bit of a systems analysis, and a sort of theme of time and relationships came out, which is one of the reasons why, when we were thinking about what would make really good webinars, this one seemed to be a great example just from that relationship perspective. But you've just highlighted this time, and the time that is required to establish and maintain those relationships. But we also know that lots of people complain of being short of time, not just in the science system in general, but how, again, like what strategies have you been able to use to make sure that you are creating and making the time and sort of managing that against what would be other competing, you know, other things that are really competing for your time?
I don't know whether I've got a good answer for that. I mean, we just did it. I mean, we had both Graham Nugent, who really started the relationship, and myself. We just had an open door or an open phone policy to Paul Livingston, and we were just receptive. Every time he rang up and wanted to talk through an issue, we were prepared to do it, because Osprey was a major client, and we accepted that, you know, we had to put ourselves out to maintain that relationship.
Yeah.
And on the other side of that, I would say that being receptive and available like that is really, really helpful, because often we'll get a question at very short notice that we need to respond to, and having the backup of the researchers is very valuable.
So Mark, was the design of that capability piece of funding, which effectively gave you that free access, was that quite consciously designed because you'd kind of already learnt that from experience and you were trying to formalize that?
Yep, it was.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Ross, you've got your hand up.
I have. Hey, I was just wanted to ask the team there, is, you know, obviously this partnership model and the relationship you hold has been hugely successful. I was just thinking in terms of the other research you're involved in, Andrew and Bruce, would would ideally, is that sort of a partnership always relevant for areas of research you're involved in, or other areas of research? And if it is, why, what are we doing often enough, or what's stopping us doing it more often?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in some ways the part of the success was, I mean, there's economies of scale, I guess. So there was a really big amount of research funding that enabled a lot of our sort of time and effort to be taken up by that. Whereas obviously with some contracts that we might have with other clients, it might be very small jobs, and so it's it comes back to the funding, I suppose. It's sometimes if we just don't have the luxury of time to build up some of those relationships. I mean, there was a key part that we've sort of mentioned a couple of times, is that sometimes it's the stability of people as well. So the individuals involved. It's not like you're dealing with a different person at a regional council, for example, every 6 months. There was a lot of stability there for sure. I mean, that's not to say that it's not like every piece of research that we did with Osprey resulted in a change. I mean, there were some things that we might think were good science, but for various reasons they might not have been operationalized. So, but that's, we've got different they've got different pressures on them to actually implement things than we do, and so sometimes things would just they were done and interesting, or it might just be that the research, as research sometimes is, it doesn't give the answer that you expected or hoped, so.
And if I can add to that, Ross, so MPI have got a new program of research on wallabies. So I suggested them at an early stage, because we had a very effective relationship with Osprey. Would they be interested in a partnership, a research partnership? Yep. So we've just worked through that, and part of that also includes a separate project around advice. So again, it's so all the operational staff out there have online access to us at any time. So we're basically trying to mimic the Osprey partnership.
Yeah.
But it does need that quantum of work. It needs, it's a program. It's not a project.
Quantum of work to give that funding flexibility.
Yeah.
Bruce, can I just remind me the MB funding that you have used over the last 10 years, that has been the SIF funding, as opposed to, has there been any Endeavour funding, or that? No.
Okay. The recent partnership was SIF funding. The only government MB equivalent was forced, through the foundation.
Way back.
But they had different rules for funding back then.
Daniel, I haven't forgotten about your question, and Aaron's just asked one. Seeing as we're talking about the funding point, we'll pick up Aaron's question, and then I'll go to Daniel's. So Aaron is asking about, is the stability in the client part of the equation, e.g. DOC continues to exist, but their funding and priorities waxes and wanes, and you just mentioned people move on, versus Osprey, which has had a clearer and much more stable focus. Has that helped, or is it?
Well, I think the stability is really important. I think if you've got more churn, you have to work a lot harder, and that takes a lot more time, and that's what I don't think we have time to do. So our interactions, I think, with Osprey could be a lot more effective and efficient because of that stability. Mark, were you going to add?
I was just going to say that it does depend on the stage of your program you're at, and also management. So you might have some stability within the organisation, but the priorities within the organisation can change. And also Bruce and Andrew and the team have done a lot of really good research, to the point where we know a lot more about things and don't require quite as much research going forward. So there is a maturity in terms of the program going forward, which can change that relationship slightly.
Yeah, and Robin's just made a sort of a supporting point, but in a different direction, just talking about another spin-off of just having that relationship established, was that it then created the opportunity for the social research to be carried out on social license to for the use of 1080, and that enabled that to be kind of quickly stood up and kind of delivered, as opposed to what might otherwise be a very transactional and quite laborious process. Was yeah, lots of question marks. Just to go back to Daniel's question, he was asking in terms of understanding why Manaaki Whenua's outputs may or may not have contributed to beneficial outcomes. Whose responsibility do you think it is to monitor and keep records on this? So, you know, it's getting to that contribution question. How whose job is it to say, well, we contributed this much versus somebody else?
I guess it's a team effort here. So I mean, we're all working together, and we have a really good working relationship with Landcare Research. We also have relationships with other researchers as well. So it's the collaboration, I guess, across the board. So Osprey is constantly measuring the benefit they're getting from the research they do, and that determines what further research they'll do in the areas that they'll go into. So I guess it is the people who pay need to monitor what they're getting in terms of bang for their buck, but collectively we all need to be moving in the right direction. And I know the research organisations are trying to find that next piece of information that will help get us one step further, and also give them the ability to carry out more research.
Yeah. One of the questions I've got here is, I appreciate you've already made it clear that this has kind of reached a level of maturity. So what might be going forward for this specifically might be kind of, you know, might be just sort of diminishing. But you've mentioned the wallabies. I was just wondering, what are the opportunities and risks that you can see going into the future if you reflect on what's important, but what are the enablers and the barriers to this type of work working well, looking forward with any other kind of similar programs of work? What are some of the things that you can see are risks that might need to be carefully managed, you know, for the sort of the current state that we are in or likely to move into?
Not sure I'm competent to
And
answer
actually,
that question.
well,
But-
and so actually, I should be clear, I'm not actually asking for like big government policy kind of sweeping political statements. I'm actually thinking far more practically, like, well, for example, is there a risk to those relationships that have been built up over a long period of time? And if things are changing, does that actually create its own different risk going forward? Or are there different opportunities that you now have space to capitalize on through this?
Were you going to say something, Mark?
I was just going to comment. Just in general terms, I think because we've got this close relationship, if we're thinking in a slightly different direction because of the stage we're at, where things are changing, I feel quite comfortable going to Bruce and Andrew and sort of saying, look, I know this is outside of your normal scope. One of the things that Landcare Research did, which was out of their normal bounds, was they actually contributed to some work which was epidemiological work associated with testing of livestock. So they have the expertise to be able to step into that space and sort of stretch themselves. And because we've got that relationship already built, that's certainly one of the first ports of call to say, okay, if you guys can't do this, who would be best to approach this? I don't know if that answered your question, but in terms of it's leveraging off that relationship to the next stage.
Yeah.
I think at a higher level, more generally, and I didn't really want to bring up funding, but a lot of these relationships are lubricated by adequate funding. And we've just got to be honest with that. CRIs, you know, we operate like a commercial entity. We've got to have revenue, and Osprey has realised that, and they put a proportion of their budget annually into research. So if you can have a relationship like that, then that helps to make it work if the funding is there. But I think in terms, I mean, in terms of the animal work that we do, a big area where we could have a big impact is around deer, and that hasn't been funded because, and we've often thought, you know, how can we develop an endeavour bid in this space? But it's all business as usual. It's a lot of applied stuff, so we can't. But DOC doesn't have the funding to fund it as Osprey did, so it just sits there.
Yeah.
And we've been talking about that for 10 years. Now everyone's saying, shit, deer are a problem out there. What do we do about it? What's the answer to this question? Well, sorry, we haven't done any research on it. And it's the same with sort of slash and the, you know, the problem in the East Coast that they're currently having. Research wasn't funded. It didn't have the high science excellence. It was too applied, didn't get funding. Now I'd imagine everyone's going to be asking questions. So there's just I think there's a conversation needs to be had about how do we fund the applied stuff. It's still excellent science, but it's more applied. And I just think there's a bit of a, I don't know, some people call it the valley of death there. There's a bit of a gap where things are falling through the crack. Yeah. That's my personal view. That's not a Manaaki Whenua view.
And so, Ross, that's what you were, you included a slide which it was kind of like that valley of death.
Yep.
And I think the bridge that you were kind of filling in there between the applied and the fundamental was the strategic investment.
Yep.
And so when you talk about the strategic investment, are you talking about that kind of conscious decision Manaaki Whenua made to put the SIF funding in, and then the conscious decision that Osprey made to just, here's the chunk of money? That's what you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, that gap I had there, and I filled it with that red. So you partly fill that with SIF. But SIF also has to support early career researchers and other strategic priorities. So often the opportunity to take some outputs from fundamental research through to applied and deliver an impact doesn't happen. There's just not enough resources there to do it.
Yeah. I wonder just one other kind of follow-up question, I suppose. We've got the luxury of talking at length about this because we do have what is a program of work over you know, more than a decade, almost 2 decades really. But I know that this isn't the only work that you have done. Can you offer, if you think about what's made this really successful from your perspective, and perhaps contrast that to some of the other work that you've been involved with, what would be sort of the noticeable points of contrast where this work, maybe it's got this potential for impact, but you're not quite landing it in the way that you would like because of X, Y, or Z?
Andrew, Mark, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, as a researcher coming into the organisation at the time when the relationship was pretty well established, it was definitely a rewarding area of work to be in, because you knew that the work there was a need for it from the agency, and that the research was for the most part operationalized and made a real world sort of impact and difference. So it sort of made you more motivated to sort of keep the ideas coming and those sorts of things. So it's I mean, that's a sort of a personal sort of thing. I mean, some of the research we do, a report might get written for an agency and you're just not quite sure if it's landed or if there's been any uptake or not. And it sort of, you know, you could be cynical and say, well, it pays the bills and keeps the lights on a little bit, but, you know, it's not necessarily rewarding. Whereas this was, because of that strong relationship and the you could actually see the impact it was having. that was a real point of difference, I think.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I think one characteristic of it that really made it successful is that the objective that Osprey is trying to achieve was really clear, and that was to reduce and eliminate infected herds. Where a lot of the other work we do is in the biodiversity space, around predator management and that sort of thing, and the objective is often not clear, sometimes changing. So it's harder to have an impact there, because it's often harder to get the end users to actually really agree what the objectives are.
Yeah, and Mark, I can see that you've made a similar comment, that direct application, sort of real clear, this is what we're trying to deliver, and that progress towards it helps. Yeah. This is probably a question more for Andrew and Bruce, but what advice might you give to some of our early career researchers in terms of, reflecting on the value of this sort of long-term relationship? What would you say they should be trying to do in their own work?
Yeah, I mean, I guess because I was relatively early career coming into this work, and so definitely learned a lot about. I mean, Bruce has already mentioned it. I guess the really meeting often with clients and really trying to drill down as to what the need was and what they wanted. Lots and lots of conversations. Again, there's limitations on that depending on the size of the funding that you've got, but it's not just a case of sort of coming up with an idea that gets funded and ticks a box and going away and doing it and delivering it, and hopefully it lands. It needs sort of lots of engagement early and often, really. And not to be shy about asking questions too. I mean, we had a pretty, and still do, honest and open relationship, I think. So we would ask some pretty, well, I would ask some pretty dumb questions of the Osprey team, trying to get an understanding about terminologies and things, and they might have been feeling the same way about, again, learning each other's areas of expertise.
Bruce, did you have anything to add?
No, just you've got to sort of walk in the other's shoes. So, and again, that's just what Andrew said. And we did that for a couple of us through secondments. But if you don't need, if you can't make that formal, then at least spend some time with your major clients just to really understand the world from their view. Their context.
Thanks, Bruce. You've done a good job of picking up on Frank's comment in the chat about secondments, because I was quite keen just to hear what is specifically the value of those. Frank, did you have any other questions or comments there?
No, I just think it's fantastic. I mean, I've got someone in my team that's seconded to another agency. It's a tricky one. We've had some excellent secondments, and then we lose our people. But that's something to do with pay parity in the sector. But James will sort that out, I'm sure. I mean, I just think the walk in their shoes is priceless, and I actually think that valley of death that everybody talks about is so true, and there's no way we would be talking about this 20-year story if there wasn't that initial forced funding and there was this SIF strategic fund, which they've managed to balance and push through with input from a very excellent stakeholder like Osprey with a clear vision. And when you talk about impact, this is multiple years of work beyond any MB bid. So I'm sad on one front that we could never write an MB now to, tackle deer or something like that. It wouldn't be sexy enough, as Bruce has said, the old force model. And I'm telling you now that we are having this discussion because there was initial big funding like that to do the fundamental work. So I despair now that unless it's sexy enough or innovative, we're missing those opportunities, right? Because it's obviously a problem. And Bruce is right, it'll be Slash or the next thing that's like at the height of, we had the same experience with myrtle rust. That'll get, because it's like topical, but at least in between, I think the model of having people moving between agencies, which has been signalled in the Green Paper, I think is an excellent thing, because I think it adds to the durability and trust of that relationship forming. And you're very lucky to have people that were around for the continuity of so many years, and Paul Livingston, who I've met, and Graham. But I think the way you mitigate the changes in some agencies, even someone like Doc, is that at least you are in their space and there's some continuity of flow. And that might be a mechanism to deliver true impact beyond the life of any funded program.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Just I'm watching the time. We've got 1 minute to go, but Hillary asked a really great question, so I'm going to ask it very directly and sort of a yes, no, maybe response. She was just noting that a lot of the sort of the vibe of the conversation, what's in the white paper for Te Ara Pairangi is kind of in this area around. And are you feeling optimistic about that level of discussion? Do you think that's a good sign, or are you being cynical?
Well, if the discussion's being had, if people are talking
Yeah.
about them, that's a good thing. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, look, I just want to say another massive thank you to you, Bruce and Andrew, and to Mark. It's just been such a fantastic conversation. So my thanks again. And also just to remind you all that the next free webinar from iPEN is going to be Impact Pathways again, actually, but this is looking at commercialisation. So James Hutchinson, the Chief Executive at KiwiNet and one of our iPEN friends, we like to call him, he's going to be talking about, demystifying commercialisation. So please come. This is actually a beautiful segue off this session. So I hope you can make it then. Details are in our newsletter. Chanel, I've forgotten the exact date, but we always time it near the end of the month. So so late March. Otherwise, thanks all for coming. Really appreciate your time and attention and your questions. I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe and go well.
Thank you very much, Cara.
Yep,
Thanks
thanks for the
Cara.
opportunity. Thank you.
Bye.